Hello. Man of War is the game of raging sea battles in the Warhammer world. A game of naval warfare where you can maneuver your fleets across the seas and around islands by sails and oars, steam and slaves, delivering a barrage of cannon fire against your enemies. You can drill through hulls, pilot swift submarines, and even use a steamroller to crush your enemies at sea. This is a game of pure chaos. Ships catch fire, lose crews, and sink spectacularly. And you can encounter startling magic, surprising sea monsters, and a maelstrom of mayhem. For some folks, myself included, this is one of the most fun games Games Workshop ever released, featuring a miniatures range of a scale and type we've almost never seen again, and intricate and absurd rules that are memorable in all the best ways. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're charting a course through the history of Man of War. Following in the wake of the 1992 Warhammer Fantasy Battles 4th edition starter box that herald a new era in Games Workshop's attempts to create accessible and new starter-friendly big box games, there came something brand new to the Warhammer world, something that had never been seen before, and which was almost guaranteed to float your boat. On the surface, Man of War is a pretty simple game. Fleets of ships from almost every active Warhammer faction of the era would maneuver across the seas, avoiding islands and treacherous rocks. When they got close enough to enemy vessels, they would bombard them with cannon and arrow and bolt thrower fire, go in to ram them, send over boarding parties, and essentially do everything they can to make sure that nothing is left but flotsam. The rules made use of a card and token based system where each vessel has its own board and a ton of card chits that are used to represent crews and fires and all sorts of other inconvenient eventualities that might take place on board. It wasn't especially complicated once you understood it, but with the many pieces and components on the board, it could look a bit fiddly. Thankfully, all of that cardboard was serving a purpose, making sure that it was an immersive and exciting game to play. The first proper game of naval combat in Warhammer's known world, this 1993 classic was a brilliant excuse to explore the wild and wonderful war fleets of the different factions of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle game. There were incredible floating Tzeentchian horrors, rickety orc sea hulks, steam-powered dwarf ironclads, and so much more. This game didn't ply the seas for very long, but whilst it was there, it made a phenomenal splash. To be honest, you couldn't ask for more from Man of War. Now, before we embark on this history of Man of War, I just want to remind you about patreon.com/Jordan Sorcery, where you can find exclusive interviews, articles, history, and so much more. It is the best place to support me, and you can also find a load of free stuff there as well, so it's worth checking out if you're interested in this kind of stuff and want to see more of my work. Right, so we know Man of War will take Warhammer to the waves, but it wasn't the first time that we'd actually seen the seas of the known world. There had been a couple of attempts to simulate waterborne combat in GW history, though they didn't always favour the fighting ships. Many were actually about the fighting sailors. A notable example was in White Dwarf issue 82, when Gary Chalk shared rules for ship-to-ship boarding party battles. The article was called All the Nice Dwarves Love a Sailor, a reference to the music hall song from 1908, Ship Ahoy, All the Nice Girls Love a Sailor, and it also included modelling advice for constructing your own Warhammer-scale ships to fight over. During the second edition of Warhammer, there were a series of campaign packs, each designed to introduce more of the setting, tell humorous and dramatic stories, and spotlight different forces at war in this emerging world. Some of those, like Terror of the Lichmaster, remain classics to this day, but one that was announced never actually made it to publication, and it does sound like it might have featured some more sea-based warfare. Work is already underway on another scenario pack, Hell's Bells and Buckets of Blood. This one is to be set on the high seas, featuring model galleons, pirates, plotters, Captain Crook, and the crew of the Ents Surprise. That tease appeared in 1986's Third Citadel Journal, but no such pack would ever get released. In 1990, Nigel Stillman and Rick Priestley delivered their massive-scale Warhammer game, Mighty Empires. A hexagonal tile map representing the geography of the Warhammer world could be populated with cities, wizards' towers, dragons, and armies, allowing for epic campaigns to be fought in a similar way to the Total War video game series would do many years later. Included in the box were a number of galleons that represented traders and merchants from harbour cities in coastal regions. Several metal miniatures were also released to expand the game, including a very nifty little pirate ship. Both the regular and pirate galleys were of a slightly different scale not only to the rest of Mighty Empires, but also to the man of war ships that would come later. But they were still pretty cool. Of course, those examples are not games of naval warfare in the Warhammer world. They're something quite different. In fact, there is no direct relationship. There is no precursor to Man of War in the same way that other Games Workshop games seem to have. If you think of Advanced Hero Quest and Warhammer Quest that would come after it, Space Fleet and then later Battlefleet Gothic, there's no equivalent journey for this game. It is something, relatively speaking, brand new, and it owes its creation largely to the arrival of a singular designer at Games Workshop's design studio. Nigel Stillman's recruitment into the design studio at Games Workshop was heralded in April 1988's White Dwarf issue 100. Nigel Stillman is yet another ex-archaeologist. What with him and Darren Matthews and Rick Priestley and Graham Davis, GW now has a veritable burrowing of archaeologists, if that's the right word. Anyway, Nigel has been a wargamer since he was little, and he's co-written a book on armies of the ancient Near East, in between digging up Black Death victims. Now he's a full-time Warhammer battle game writer. You'll be seeing some of his work in due course. Those first contributions appeared in White Dwarf, and Stillman's experience writing that book of armies from the ancient Near East served him well as lead writer on the first ever Warhammer Armies book. He'd go on to work extensively in Warhammer Fantasy over its next few editions, composing armies books like the Bretonnians, Lizardmen, and Dogs of War. He also worked closely with Rick Priestley, having created Mighty Empires with him, and contributed to the Orc books for 40k. Not just that, but he would go on to be involved in the creation of the Warhammer historical rules as well. Although there were no prior examples of games of naval combat from Games Workshop, that doesn't mean that there were none out there in the wider tabletop world. As an avid gamer and historian, it seems possible, if not likely, that Nigel Stillman would have been familiar with at least a couple of them. Not least because one of them is the first ever wargame created, at least in terms of the kind of commercial product that we would understand one as today. Although the Prussian military developed war games for training purposes as early as 1811, Kriegspiel is famously regarded as the earliest war game, given it's literally in the title, after all. The actual first war game that you could buy seems to have been Rules for the Jane Naval War Game. It came out in 1898, and according to Wikipedia, it was delivered in a crate. The game was designed by Fred Jane, who may be familiar to the militaristic and or historicalistic amongst you as the creator of Janes, a very long-running series of guides and information services about the designs, types, and capabilities of military vehicles and systems. What started with Jane's Fighting Ships, a collection of Fred Jane's ship illustrations released in the same year as the game, has continued to this day as a global organisation selling insights on modern defence and security apparatus. The rules for the Jane Naval Wargame, however, appear to be much harder to come by in this modern era. Many years later, games like 1973's Trafalgar and the phenomenally titled Wooden Ships and Iron Men, released in 1974, would package up the simulation of historical sea battles from the Age of Sail, like the Battle of the Nile and, unsurprisingly, the Battle of Trafalgar. There were also, of course, a host of nautically focused World War II war games released through the 70s and 80s. But up to that point, as far as I can tell, there were no games based on naval warfare at sea that did not take place in history, or at the very least, in the real world. Whether Nigel Stillman had any of these games in mind as he got to work on his own game of combat at sea, I have no idea. But he did mention at least one element of the inspiration in an interview that he gave to the Give 'em Lead blog in 2016. Later, I worked on Man of War, devising the basic game, which was of course based on Renaissance naval warfare. I'm no expert on that era of war at sea, but I do know that it featured vessels under sail and oar, cannon and small arms fire, anti-personnel scatter or grape shot, boarding parties, and for good measure, the occasional ram, all of which would be well represented in Man of War, along with wizards, ships with claws, drills on their prows, steamrollers, flying vessels, ships that were just one big gun, and so much more whimsically brilliant nonsense. All of which is to say that whilst there is a prestigious lineage of simulationist tabletop naval warfare games, this isn't quite one of those. There are elements of that in here for sure, and the historian and archaeologist Nigel Stillman certainly knew his cannonballs and brought plenty of that realism to his game. But this is also something that had never been done before. This is a game by Games Workshop, and it takes all of the wonderfully wacky fantasy of Warhammer and puts that together with that simulation of naval warfare. It creates something that is unique and, in the truest sense of the word, fantastic. One of the first appearances of Man of War in the public came in May 1991 at the Derby Assembly Rooms. This was where some of the early Golden Demon competitions and games days took place, and alongside the painted minis, there was always an array of participation and demo games. During that 1991 event, Nigel Stillman teamed up with Andy Jones, the man behind many of GW's special projects like Warhammer Records and running the Golden Demon competition itself, and who would later go on to develop Warhammer Quest. Together, they could be found running a simulation of naval combat in the Warhammer world. It was literally called Warhammer Naval Battle. And if you're an extreme collector, someone is apparently selling on eBay right now the actual sign that was above that demo table at Golden Demon, featuring signatures from many of the GW team, no less. For the demo, Stillman actually scratch-built all of the terrain and miniatures that were used. White Dwarf 139's after-action report for the Golden Demon event even showed off a photo of the demo game in action, and it looked a lot like the final version of Man of War actually would when it was released. In October's White Dwarf 143, there was a little more revealed about this new game, including, in the context of the game, the first reference to what would become the name of the game, Man of War. They also showed off a whole raft of John Blanche concept sketches for different sea vessels from the many Warhammer factions. Some, though not all, of these magnificent ships seen across the double-page spread would end up being released for the game. There were a couple, however, like the entire series of elf ships, that would see some pretty major redesigns before they made it to the tabletop. The name of the game, Man of War, is a common contraction of the Royal Navy term Man of War, which was used in reference to big and powerful ships. The Man of War were classified according to a 6-point rating scale, running from small convoys at the 6th rating, all the way up to the 3-deck, 80-gun behemoths that made up the most powerful ships of the line at the 1st rate. Of course, some historians dispute those facts, instead claiming that Man of War was actually a type of 80s rock band and the kings of metal. The feature makes clear, though, that there is still quite a lot more work to do on the game, and that would prove to be very, very true. We wouldn't see anything else from Man of War for about another 18 months. But when it did finally surface, it would ride a spectacular wave indeed. Like a celebratory cannonade, White Dwarf number 160 introduced a brand new big boxed game as a complete tabletop experience for 2 players. The cover art depicted the chaotic maelstrom of raging sea battles, with boarding parties preparing to brave the waves. It was painted by the incredible Jeff Taylor, who had also provided the cover for the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and many more iconic big box covers like Warhammer Quest and Titan Legions. Throughout the rulebook, Man of War would feature a treasure trove of amazing art by artists that included John Blanche, Wayne England, Simon Smith, Dave Gallagher, Dave Andrews, and even more work from Jeff Taylor. Amongst the brilliantly characterful images of orc captains and various mighty ships at war, possibly my favourite piece of art is the actual rulebook cover by John Blanche. It's just an incredibly evocative scene depicting that chaos and carnage that you would expect in a sea battle in Warhammer. Though Nigel Stillman was at the helm for the creation and design of Man of War, it was more hands on deck at the Citadel Design Studio, as he was joined by Andy Jones and Bill King. Speaking with the website TechRaptor in 2020, Andy Jones shared a little bit of insight into the development of the game. Seriously, Nigel was the expert on all things historical. Bill got to write cool colour text and argue, very well as it happens, about the game design, and I got to stop anyone actually coming to blows. Dice were often thrown at each other, lots of stomping off for a bit, but no serious injuries were recorded. And in an interview with the Realm of Chaos 80s blog in 2015, Bill King, the influential Warhammer author who had created Gotrek and Felix, talked very, very briefly about his involvement in the creation of Man of War. There's not really much detail about this game in particular, but it's a cute little quote, so I wanted to include it. I ended up as a developer during my next stint at the design studio, a couple of years in the early 90s. I did a fair amount of writing and testing on Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Man of War. I contributed to a few of the early army books. I was the first person ever to lose to Jervis Johnson in a published battle report. Now there's a real claim to fame. King's fiction appeared in the game in the form of 6 small vignettes. As you might expect, these are tales of hard-bitten captains, tense naval standoffs, and dramatic fleet actions. Each places a real emphasis on name-checking the fleets and ships that are detailed in the game. The Man of War box itself is stuffed to the gills with amazing components. There are lots of templates, there are turning templates and range fire templates, islands, and lots of card pieces, counters, all sorts. It is a fantastic collection of stuff. And like many of the big boxes of this era, once everything was taken off of sprues, it kind of coalesces in the bottom corner of the box and doesn't really need quite so much space. But it's very impressive when you first crack that box open, because it looks absolutely stunning. And everything that's in there was beautifully made. And you get everything you need alongside a rulebook and miniatures to have your first games of Man of War between Imperial forces and pirates. Only 6 fleets were detailed in the army lists that were featured in this core rulebook: the Empire, High Elves, Dwarfs, Orcs, Dark Elves, and Bretonnians, the latter of which would be one of the only Man of War fleets from a faction that didn't actually receive a dedicated Warhammer Armies book for the then current 4th edition of the Fantasy Battles game. It does seem, though, that Nigel Stillman had a bit of a soft spot for Bretonnia, which may account for their prominence in the game. Perhaps the real Stillmania was for the French. The 12 plastic ships in the box were all of the same Imperial war galley design, each with a neat mast from a shared sprue and pre-printed paper sails that allowed you to bring the ships to life. The plastic mast sprue was actually a genius bit of design, ensuring that the same components could be mass-produced and shared between a large number of different ships across the entire Man of War range. Much like the inclusion of 2 fleets of the same ship type in the starter box, it was a canny business move that made the creation of the game more economically viable in the first place. The same kind of business thinking that had been responsible for elevating the importance of the Horus Heresy as an excuse for the same faction to be fighting itself back when they were producing the Adeptus Titanicus box. The sails were also a smart decision too, helping to usher in a new era of coloured paper banners on the backs of Warhammer and 40k heroes, and giving each vessel in a fleet a pop of intricate colour work. They were also a necessity in Man of War specifically because they gave you a way to distinguish between identical miniatures for your ships of the line, most of which would take to the seas in squadrons of 3. It wasn't just plastic that was in this box though, there was a tidal wave of card components too. As well as every ship having its own card template, there were also tokens or counters, and there were a lot of tokens and counters, an absolute just tsunami of them. There are a great number of counters in Man of War: crew counters, wound counters, flagship counters, treasure counters, wizard markers, admiral markers, wizard level counters, damage counters, blaze counters, wizard college counters, wreck markers, debris markers, and so on. And so on? Goodness me, what could possibly be left that would need a counter? Well, I suppose there were the elf war dancers as well, and probably lots of other stuff too. There's loads of counters here. The reason that there were so many counters was because every single ship in your fleet had one of these ship templates, and you would use it to track everything from the crew to damage to fires and wizards and all sorts. It was a really nifty bit of game design, but it meant that there was a lot of fiddly stuff going on. But it did make it incredibly immersive, at least in my opinion. And because of this, you also got to track every single ship in your fleet, which was really important that they were all distinct and they had their own unique things going on, because your fleet might only have 6 or 7 miniatures in it. But altogether, it still looked like an impressive battle at sea. Man of War was not the first GW game to make use of vehicle templates. In fact, it had become something of a fashion in the early 90s. 1988's Adeptus Titanicus included Titan data cards, convenient reference sheets broadly similar to the bestiary entries seen in books for 40k and Warhammer Fantasy. By 1994's Titan Legions, the data cards would be used for hit locations in roughly the same way that Warhammer 40,000's new vehicle cards would work. The 1991 game Space Fleet, which promised mighty spaceships fighting in galactic combat, also utilised reference cards for each ship. That was a holdover from the original Richard Halliwell designs for Battlefleet Gothic, which had been cancelled in favour of the more simple and accessible Space Fleet game. Of course, it's still surprising that 40k received a naval combat game before Warhammer Fantasy did, but there you go. Oh, and I have some very exciting news regarding those original plans for Battlefleet Gothic, which I will be talking about in a couple of videos in the not too distant future, so keep your eyes peeled for a pretty stunning Magic Mailbag episode on the channel coming soon. This was an era when Games Workshop was producing a lot of supplements that were entirely card-based, like Warhammer's Battle Magic, which had more than 200 spells and item cards, and then in 2nd edition 40k's Dark Millennium box, which was full of psychic powers and those aforecastle mentioned vehicle cards. The economics of card printing favoured these kinds of products in the 90s, and making games with vast card contents like Warhammer Quest was far more viable than it might later become. None of those other games quite used their vehicle templates in the same way as Man of War though, and in fact the cardboard starboard ship template of Man of War was just a really cool bit of design. So how exactly did it work? For each ship in your fleet, you have a ship template. It tells you the important locations on the vessel, which can be damaged in battle, and it allows you to keep track of that damage, your crew, special passengers like wizards and admirals, and various other status effects. All of those, represented by tokens, are applied directly to the template. An enemy broadside destroys your mast, you stick a damage token on that location, and it will affect your ability to move under sail in the future. A fire breaks out on a deck, you add a blaze token. Crew get killed and you remove one of their tokens. If a ship has no crew left, it becomes abandoned, or taken over by enemy crew, it becomes captured. The only colour card ship templates that were actually featured in the core box were those for the Imperial and Pirate war galleys that had miniatures, which meant that if you wanted to field any other fleet, you would have to photocopy the black and white templates that were included in the rulebook. This was, of course, a bit of an inconvenience to say the least, but it would be remedied by the later supplements for the game, and I suppose more industrious and creative gamers could fashion their own ship templates by copying them from the book. To determine where damage lands, the attacking player rolls a dice, hitting the area with the corresponding location number on the ship template. Most vessels could take damage on the decks and above, but still stay in the fight. But taking a couple of below the waterline hits would cause them to sink. Special weapons like the Orc Driller Killers could deal damage directly below the waterline, but the typical way that you'd score damage in that area was by inflicting critical hits, and they happened when you damaged a part of the ship which had already been destroyed. In those instances, you'd roll on the critical hit table, which might result in the captain having a bad time, the crews getting killed, the ship catching fire, or up to 3 below the waterline hits in one go that was pretty sure to sink most vessels. It was from the critical hits table that you could find yourself having to roll on the captain's table as well. And what that meant was that you could have stuff happen like your captain gets washed overboard or your crew mutiny. It was, like I say, it is fiddly and there's a few things going on, but it's really immersive as well, and it is a lot of fun. I don't know if it's literally every single miniature in the Man of War range, but I do know that the majority of them were sculpted by the same person, including the plastic war galleys that were featured in the starter box. There were some fantastic models made for Man of War, and they were created by Citadel's straight-line sculptor, Norman Swales. Swales had previously worked at Hinchcliffe, the historical miniatures company founded in 1967, where he illustrated some of their catalogues. At Citadel, he specialised in war machines and vehicles, literally the miniatures that would require straight edges. Amongst his many amazing miniatures, you'll find the wagon part of the Empire War Wagon that was actually recently re-released for the Old World. He also did one of the early Space Marine Predators, and the classic Skaven Screaming Bell. Between John Blanche's ship concepts, Alan Merritt's creative input, and Norman Swale's sculpting, the Man of War launch range was something pretty special. Those initial miniatures included the Imperial fleet with its mighty great ship, the Dwarf fleet with its ironclads, the Dark Elves with their castle-riding sea monsters, and the still very beautiful Bretonnian galleon. In a relatively unusual move for the time, miniatures for Man of War were all released in boxes. There were no blister packs available at all. Typically, the larger vessels came in a box on their own, and then the smaller ships of the line came in complete squadrons of 3. That meant that some of the boxes were wildly oversized for the actual miniatures inside, but others seemed super small. Of all the ships released for the game, I can't help but marvel at the scope and wonderful silliness of the Dark Elf Black Ark of Naggaroth. It was the first time we really got to see what these floating fortresses might actually look like, and I think they are ludicrous and brilliant. Intriguingly, per Andy Jones, the original intention was for the game to not include any miniatures at all. One hiccup was that the game was designed to come with card ships, beautiful art from Wayne, England. And then, at the last minute, new Uber boss Tom Kirby decreed no game would come without plastic models. So we scrambled for the plastic galleys, a good decision in retrospect. This is an interesting point about the actual business models behind Games Workshop's releases of that time. I've already mentioned that many supplements would be card-based, and it's interesting to see that a big boxed game was going to be entirely card-based as well at one point in its development. Of course, the move to plastic has long been Games Workshop's biggest strategy, so it's perhaps not surprising that this marked an early example of that approach. Presumably, the Wayne England art for the cards that Jones refers to are the same stunning pieces that are presented throughout the rulebook, each providing a magnificent impression of the characterful ships that make up the various fleets of the Warhammer factions. As you would expect, there was plenty of Man of War content featured in White Dwarf, although a lot of it ended up being reprints of rules that were featured in the main game or the supplements, so there wasn't a huge expanse of new material for you to use in your games. But it was still nice to see some amazing heavy metal models and some other cool stuff too. As well as battle reports, painting guides, and frequently asked questions, there was also some limited new rules content scattered throughout the run. After the release article in issue 160, there was a strategy guide in issue 161, as well as a condensed battle report that told of the Battle of Death's Point, a brutal meeting of Dwarf and Bretonnian fleets. White Dwarf 162 provided more tactical guidance, this time focused on fleets that primarily moved under sail. I will admit here though that it's probably fair to say that despite being a very fun game to play, the photographs of the battle reports in White Dwarf don't always give it the most dynamic sense of excitement, sadly. There was also a dedicated article on the Dwarf Dreadnought, the biggest ship in the Dwarfen fleet. My favourite article for the game can be found in White Dwarf 167, an expansion of the rules in the core rulebook for the use of shore forts. This article, written by Andy Jones, allowed for a range of different sized fortifications to be used in games, and the converted models that represent them in the article made terrific use of the castle pieces from the Mighty Empires game. I think that they just look awesome. The Citadel Journal, having been refloated in 1994, also included some articles for Man of War, offering unofficial new rules like Dwarf runesmiths. Of particular note was the Undead Fleet that was covered in issues 6 and 9. The Undead were one of the only major Warhammer Fantasy battle armies that didn't receive an official Man of War fleet by the end of the game's run. Thankfully, journal readers plugged those holes by creating a fleet filled with ghost ships and even a floating necropolis. Much like those Warhammer and 40k supplements that were released around this time that were just full of cards and templates, there would be some expansions for Man of War that would be just the same. It would get not just one, but 2 treasure chests full of cardboard to expand your game and make it even more flammable. Previewed just a few months after the release of the base game, in July 1993's White Dwarf issue 163, came Plague Fleet, This expansion was focused on the forces of chaos, and it included complete army lists for the Slaanesh, Nurgle, Khorne, Tzeentch, Skaven, and Chaos Dwarf fleets. It also came with proper, colour, printed cardboard ship templates for all of those Chaos fleets, as well as the Dark Elf fleet from the main game. The box featured a stunning piece of Mark Gibbons art, some simply sublime nautical Nurgle artwork. Amongst the coolest new stuff, I think, was the Great Winged Terror of Tzeentch, a ship that flies, the Clan Pestilence Deathburner, a ship with fleas, the Chaos Dwarf Hull Destroyer, a ship that prongs, and the Nurgle Plague Ship, a ship that pongs. And then we got the second and final expansion for the game, Sea of Blood, which would add 2 new dimensions. You could go below the surface of the sea to find some big, weird sea monsters, or you could go up into the clouds and fly above the surface of the sea and find some big, weird sky monsters. From Orc Wyverns to Dark Elf Manticores, Dwarf Gyrocopters to High Elf Dragon Riders, pretty much every fleet got access to new flyers that could harry the enemy fleets at speed. Like everything else, these creatures all had their own mini-templates as well, to track damage during the game. Sea of Blood provided card templates for all of those non-Chaos fleets, as well as a couple of new ships for the Empire, the Hellhammer and the Iron Fist. There was also a new fleet, the Norse, and although it only consisted of 2 ships, which were basically bigger and smaller versions of the same thing, it was lovely to see some actual modern representation of the Norse on the battlefield. Or the Battle Ocean, I suppose. Like a lot of the inclusions in the Man of War game, they feel like they are expanding the world. It's completely thematic that the Norse would be present in sea battles in Warhammer. Plus, they seem like a really fun bunch of Viking lads. Also gaining templates, round ones this time, were the sea monsters. Ranging from Jason Statham's pal the Megalodon to an excited-looking giant crab, from a decidedly Ray Harryhausen-style Triton to a sad-looking giant fish, there were a fair few of these neutral, massive critters to choose from. In-game, they could be summoned into battle by foolhardy wizards, with no guarantee that they would actually even turn up, let alone fight for you. The box art for Sea of Blood was by the incomparable Dave Gallagher, though interestingly, the original piece shown here was mirrored for the actual cover of the boxed set. Man of War's release schedule is one of those very strange things. I think at this time, at Games Workshop, they were very much about creating a lot of material in one go, and then parceling it out in expansions. If you look at the 3rd edition of Talisman as a good example, that was all clearly designed in one go and then released over a period of months. And that happened with Man of War. Within 6 months of the game's launch, you pretty much had a complete range available. All of the fleets that were going to be released, all of the components, all of the miniatures that you would need. It was all there very quickly, which in many ways is a great thing because unlike a lot of other Games Workshop systems during this period, you had everything you needed to play whatever you wanted. It wasn't like there were armies books still on the way, or there were listings in the bestiary for things that didn't have miniatures. You pretty much had everything you needed to make any choice. That's really, really fun. But it also has the negative effect of there being nothing else to look forward to, and for this closed system to be very clearly complete, which doesn't always mean there's the longevity that you might want. Which is perhaps the reason that Man of War was relatively short-lived. The final article for the game came in White Dwarf issue 175. Just a little over a year since the launch of the game. Regardless of its lifespan, Man of War has always had a place in my heart. At my local Games Workshop store, there was a single side of a single gaming table that was painted blue for many, many years, just in case anybody wanted to take to the seas. It was a joy to see it on the rare occasion that it was flipped over. The art and miniatures of the game were just wonderful, offering a perspective and a scale for the factions of Warhammer that one rarely got to see. The inventiveness and over-the-top nature of many of the ships offered character, whimsy, and wild fantasy. It's single-handedly a counterpoint to any argument that Warhammer has always been a grounded, realistic setting. And whilst I'm sure there are folks who find some of these things to be a bit too silly, and I've been there myself at times, the game is so much fun that it really brings it all together. I still love this game that is so much about theme and feel. It is kind of unlike most other Games Workshop games. It's not totally unique, but it's not quite like a lot of the other games that they've ever released. And I think there's something very special. It still speaks to me of a certain type of game, a certain type of gameplay, and I love it so much. Even in 2011, when they released Dreadfleet, it would never quite be replicated. Where Man of War was about fleet maneuvers and coordinated tactics, Dreadfleet opted for a more skirmish-based approach, with individual vessels operating almost like special characters. An absolutely stunning production, the game was nonetheless a divisive one, and its beer and pretzels approach, with a high degree of randomness, marks quite a contrast from the more considered gameplay of Man of War, though I wouldn't for a second argue that Man of War is perfectly balanced either. In that Tech Raptor interview, Andy Jones reflected on Man of War's attempt to capture the essence of Warhammer and its factions from that era. It was actually quite straightforward to capture the themes and flavour of the various races, and looking back, I think we did that quite well. From the Orc Hulks to the Bretonnian Corsairs and Dwarf Dreadnoughts. Not to mention the Chaos Dwarf Thunderfire barges, whose smokestacks echoed the ridiculous hats of their crew, or the floating Slaneshi hellship Pleasure Palace. I don't think anyone can accuse us of being subtle. We took the big themes of the various factions and writ them large. I think that they pretty much did capture the spirit of that Warhammer era incredibly well. It speaks so much of 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy to me. For all of its flaws, for all of its fantastic whimsy, for all of its over-the-top and completely wild fantasy, it is also just a very immersive world, a place that is so much fun and that is enticing, and that's one of the reasons I fell in love with Warhammer back then. It offered so much to me, so I am very grateful that this game, this very weird and unique game, exists and is still here for us to play. Even if it's never been revisited in quite this way, it is something that is so great and so much fun and still holds up to just incredible gameplay and great times at the tabletop. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments if you've got any fond memories of Man of War. And if you would like to support my work and see more of this kind of history of Games Workshop and Warhammer and the games that they've released, then do consider checking out patreon.com/Jordan Sorcery. There is a lot of exclusive content on there that is only available to supporters. And if you just want to find out about it, go and check it out. There's some free samples as well that you might enjoy. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. If you ask me, I think more games should still come with this kind of top-down card terrain. It is just fantastic.